the Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, Mr. Shaktikant Das, the Law Secretary, Mr. Suresh Chandra, distinguished delegates from all the BRICS nations, ladies and gentlemen. This is the concluding session of this conference which dealt with the international arbitration in the BRICS itself. A decade and a half ago, for the first time, this whole idea of a possible BRICS emerging as an economic power hub and perhaps overtaking the developed world by the middle of this century was first brought up by Goldman Sachs. South Africa was a later addition to the first four nations that they mentioned. Since then, there has been a lot of upheaval in the world. And obviously, these periods have also been extremely challenging as far as the world is concerned, and the challenges don't end now. They continue to be on. There's an economic challenge which is clearly visible. Ever since the 2008 crisis, except for a brief period, the global economy itself has been facing a severe challenge. Some nations have tried to keep pace with a reasonable amount of growth rates. And it was the emerging economies, predominantly the 5 BRICS nations, which had shouldered a very large part of the global growth. After all, BRICS, the only 5 countries, is 1/2 of the world population, a very large part of the global resource, very large part of the global GDP, and led by a phenomenal growth, particularly in China and the other BRICS countries. It was this high pace of growth which was shouldering the global growth. But then in the last few years, the challenges have changed. The drop in commodity prices, mineral prices, has brought about its own challenges in Russia, in South Africa, in Brazil, because each one of these economies had some special features. Brazil was a agriculture and a commodity powerhouse. South Africa has a very rich mineral resource. Russia has a large resource, a huge historical capability. And obviously, China could not be expected to grow continuously at that phenomenal 9.5%, which they did for about 30 years. That was a phenomenal process. And therefore, the Chinese themselves conceded that the new Chinese normal was far lower than that. But notwithstanding that, these emerging economies still were ahead of the world. Though transiently, because of commodity prices and resource prices, oil prices, some of them are also facing serious challenges. But these economic challenges are almost running parallel to the political challenges which have come up. And amongst the political challenges, you have security threats created with the ISIS phenomena. You have a new wave of protectionism in the developed economies. Mr. Shaktikant Das referred to the two obvious examples. The Brexit was born out of that. On FTAs in the most developed economy of the world, there is a very strong current and a comment being made if we see the narrative of the US presidential election. Now, how far these will remain only as election issues and not translate subsequently into governance issues is yet to be seen. And that's the world we are really working in. And therefore, in this world where trade is shrinking, there is a great onerous responsibility on the emerging economies because our growth rates are much faster than the rest of the world to increase our own volumes of trade. Experiments globally have shown that those economies which have connected either their technologies or innovations because of technologies, their manufacturings, their resources, their ability at services with the global markets, and which have targeted the global markets and integrated with them, have mutually benefited. And there are these experiences of the past which are really seen ahead of us. And therefore, it's extremely important that what was predicted a decade and a half ago, if this has to come true, a larger economic cooperation of the BRICS nations, inter se them, in terms of trade, both in goods and services, will certainly have to increase. Many of the economies are already big agricultural power centers, resource power centers, manufacturing power centers. And obviously, with the increase of trade in the current world, challenges will come up as to how trade issues between investor and investor and between investor and the states are to be resolved. There are many forums which were created earlier. And some of those forums have raised legitimate questions, some of which I am told have been referred to since the morning itself. The rationale behind arbitrations is that you automatically don't submit to the domestic jurisdiction of the domestic courts itself. If parties represent entities in different international jurisdictions, they find it inherently difficult to submit to the jurisdiction of courts in one particular jurisdiction. They fear an institutional bias, and therefore to create the credibility and maintain the credibility of the decision-making process and the dispute resolution process, in various international trades you look for a neutral forum and you look for a neutral applicability of law. The experience over the years has been that some centers did monopolize a bulk of the international arbitrations. It must be said to their credit that they developed capacities. They created arbitrators of stature. They created a set of international lawyers who could practice from one jurisdiction to the other and who were familiar with processes the world around. And therefore, those jurisdictions tended to have a big share in the pie as far as the international arbitrations were concerned. many a countries feared and have been suggesting that the awards emerging out of these arbitrations are at times loaded against the emerging economies. And therefore, the need has been felt to develop parallel arbitration centers across the world. So, let alone London, let alone Paris, now we see Singapore emerging as an important arbitral center. And therefore, inter-se the BRICS nations to resolve trading disputes which may arise out of the BRICS nations itself, it's extremely important that we have to develop a mechanism as far as the BRICS nations is concerned. Now, in order to develop this mechanism, it's also necessary that we have arbitrators of great credibility. We have lawyers representing countries and parties who are lawyers with a great international lawyering ability. We also need to have a lot of restraint as far as domestic jurisdiction of courts is concerned to interfere in those arbitrations itself. You also need to create a mechanism where capacity building into, say, the BRICS nations takes place. And therefore, in each one of us, we are able to develop these centers and also to make possible the enforcement of those awards absolutely in a reasonable and simple manner. And the enforcement of those awards then has to be free from otherwise excessive intervention of domestic courts itself. Now, as the Law Secretary just mentioned, we have the UNCITRAL model law, which is common to most BRICS nations. And therefore, what is the need today, the crying need today is that over the next few months we'll have to interact more frequently. I would even go to the extent of suggesting that we have a task force of officials and experts as far as the BRICS nations are concerned, a task force which can discuss this issue at length and then set up an appropriate mechanism where we can have arbitral centers as far as the BRICS nations are concerned. And hopefully, if we are able to evolve and develop that capacity, eventually those centers will also become centers of great international acceptability, even with regard to the non-BRICS nations, as far as arbitral abilities are concerned. I think it is one fact that we raise questions about which way the arbitrations in most of these important centers are going. But it's quite another that we create more centers, we create greater ability, and we'll always keep this factor in mind that while we deal with free trade also means fair trade. Free trade only prospers when there is fair trade. And an essential aspect of that fair trade would be that the dispute resolution mechanism and its enforceability will have to be absolutely fair, detached from local commitments, and something which will enhance the cause of the agreements which have been entered into say, the countries. I'm sure as the world slowly emerges out of the current economic crisis, and I'm sure the world has the resilience to do that, trade which has shrunk will come back in a bigger way. Growth will return to the world, and certainly faster growth will return to the emerging economies, and therefore our interstate trade and trade-related issues will necessarily involve the dispute resolution mechanism, which we need to now perfect. And that's an important aspect. We must prepare ourselves for that. And I'm sure today's conference itself would be an important step in that direction. Finally, my best wishes to all of you, and I'm extremely grateful to all our international delegates who have traveled from various parts of the world to participate in this conference. Thank you.